On November 20th, 1983, America froze in place. Families stopped eating, phones went unanswered, and nearly half the country sat glued to their televisions. What they saw wasn't just a movie, it was a national panic attack beamed straight into their living rooms. How could a simple TV broadcast make millions of Americans lose sleep for days? Let's rewind to the night a story about the end of the world changed history. Broadcast night. Imagine turning on your TV expecting another made-for-television drama, maybe a bit of suspense, but nothing you couldn't shake off before bed. Instead, you're hit with the visual of mushroom clouds blooming over the Midwest, electronics frying in an instant, and ordinary people running for shelter with a hopelessness that feels real. That was the experience for the 100 million Americans who tuned in to ABC's The Day After that Sunday evening. At the time, television was dominated by three major networks. Cable was still a luxury, and streaming didn't exist. That meant when ABC decided to air a 2-hour film about the complete annihilation of the United States in a nuclear war, there was nowhere else for much of the country to look away. And ABC wasn't messing around. They took the unprecedented step of warning viewers about disturbing content beforehand and even set up counseling hotlines for anyone left shaken. From the moment the first warning tones sounded and the drama began unfolding in Lawrence, Kansas, the atmosphere in homes across America changed. Viewing parties that were supposed to be casual get-togethers turned into group therapy sessions. Parents sent kids to bed early, only to lie awake themselves, haunted by the images. Phone lines to local TV stations jammed with people asking if what they'd just seen could really happen. And here's the thing. Nothing about The Day After felt like sci-fi fantasy. The attacks came suddenly, without a hero swooping in to save the day. The fallout scenes were raw, graphic, and frighteningly plausible. ABC even made the choice to run certain sequences without commercials, refusing to break the tension with toothpaste ads. By the end of the broadcast, a stunned silence had fallen across the nation. Newspapers the next morning called it a national trauma. Time magazine described it as the television event that shook the nation. This wasn't just another Sunday movie. It was a collective nightmare shared by nearly half of America in real time. That night, The Day After didn't just entertain, it got under the skin of the entire country. And in doing so, it set off a chain reaction that went far beyond television. The Cold War. To really understand why The Day After hit so hard, you've got to remember the world it was born into. The year was 1983, and the Cold War was running hotter than it had in decades. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't just rivals, they were locked in an arms race, each side pointing thousands of nuclear warheads at the other like a high-stakes staring contest where no one dared blink. Earlier that year, tensions had spiked to terrifying levels. The Soviet Union had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 passengers and crew. Just weeks before the broadcast, NATO was running a military exercise called Able Archer. The Soviets mistook it for a possible prelude to a real nuclear strike and quietly prepared their own forces. Translation: both sides were on hair-trigger alert, and one wrong move could have ended the world. Against this backdrop, ABC took the boldest gamble in television history. Instead of a feel-good movie to distract the public, they dropped a brutally realistic portrayal of what nuclear war would actually look like for everyday Americans. No speeches from presidents, no last-minute peace deals, just the gut-punch reality of missiles launching, cities burning, and survivors scrambling in the radioactive aftermath. For people watching at home, it didn't feel like fiction. It felt like a warning that the world they were living in was dangerously close to the one on screen. And that was exactly the point. The movie's release was timed to make Americans, and maybe even their leaders, confront the fact that nuclear war wasn't just a political talking point. It was a nightmare waiting to happen. Even the White House couldn't ignore it. President Ronald Reagan watched The Day After before its public airing and later admitted in his diary that it left him greatly depressed and strengthened his resolve to work toward reducing nuclear weapons. When a movie has the power to rattle the commander-in-chief, you know it's more than entertainment. The Cold War was a powder keg, and the day after didn't just light a match, it shoved it straight into the national conversation. It made the threat of nuclear war feel personal, immediate, and terrifyingly real. Plot and setting, ordinary lives, extraordinary horror. Most nuclear war stories up to that point followed generals, presidents, or shadowy government agents. The day after flipped that on its head. Instead of the halls of power, it planted us in Lawrence, Kansas, a quiet college town in the American heartland. The decision was deliberate. No towering skylines, no iconic landmarks, just farms, classrooms, and neighborhoods that looked like anywhere, USA. We meet Dr. Russell Oakes, a Kansas City physician played by Jason Robards, who witnesses missiles launching from nearby silos. There's college student Stephen Klein, portrayed by Steve Guttenberg, dealing with the chaos as the attack looms. We follow farming families like the Dahlbergs, a nurse named Nancy Bauer, played by Jo Beth Williams, and soldiers stationed at local bases. In other words, people who could have been your neighbors, co-workers, or even you. When the attack comes, it's not dressed up in Hollywood spectacle. There's no countdown clock or stirring soundtrack. 1 minute life is normal, the next, mushroom clouds are rising over the prairie. Vehicles stall from electromagnetic pulses, and the blast effects are shown with unsettling precision. The filmmakers didn't just hint at destruction, they pulled you right into it. And then, just when you think the worst has passed, the film takes its cruelest turn. The aftermath. Radiation sickness creeps in. Infrastructure collapses. Hospitals become triage centers where doctors are forced to decide who gets care and who is left to die. Families are trapped in makeshift shelters with dwindling food and water. Law enforcement crumbles, replaced by desperation and survival instinct. The realism was brutal. Hair falling out in clumps, skin blistering from burns, mass graves dug in cold, empty fields. This wasn't science fiction. It was a disaster scenario so grounded in real-world physics and medicine that it left no room for comforting distance. By choosing everyday people as the focus, The Day After made the unthinkable intimate. It stripped away the safe buffer of watching other people suffer on screen. This time, it was the audience staring at a mirror, wondering if their own town, their own family, would survive a world like this, and whether they'd even want to. Behind the camera, making The Day After was almost as tense as the story it told. ABC Motion Pictures, President Brandon Stoddard conceived the project in 1981, just as the Reagan administration was ramping up Cold War rhetoric and military spending. He wanted a film that wouldn't just entertain, but would jolt Americans out of nuclear complacency. That idea alone was enough to scare off several directors who didn't want their careers tied to something so politically charged. Enter Nicholas Meyer, fresh from directing Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. He took the job not for the glory, but because he believed it was important to show the unshowable, the reality politicians like to keep abstract. The Pentagon refused to cooperate, fearing the movie would undercut public confidence in U.S. defense policy. The script initially ran over 4 hours and was so graphic that it included scenes of exposed bone and large-scale casualty dumps. ABC executives, nervous about public backlash, demanded cuts. Even with those cuts, Meyer fought to keep the film as uncompromising as network TV would allow. Filming took place in and around Lawrence, Kansas, with more than 2,000 locals volunteering as extras. Makeup artists worked alongside medical consultants to create disturbingly accurate radiation burn effects. Some extras quit halfway through filming because the experience felt too real. The realism extended to the locations. The crew shot at actual missile silo sites and used familiar Kansas landmarks, giving the film a documentary-like authenticity. The cast, which included veterans like Jason Robards and rising stars like Steve Guttenberg, took the work seriously. Robards later said it wasn't like acting, it was like bearing witness. As production moved forward, political pressure mounted. Conservative groups accused ABC of pushing anti-American propaganda. Others worried the broadcast could cause mass panic. ABC received thousands of letters urging them to cancel it entirely. The network didn't back down, but they took unprecedented precautions, like setting up hotlines for distressed viewers and editing the final cut to soften the most hopeless scenes. By the time it aired, about 40% of the original footage had been removed, yet it was still the most graphic depiction of nuclear war ever shown on American television. For Meyer, the compromises didn't erase the film's punch. They just made him more determined to let the story's weight hit as hard as possible. And judging by what happened next, it worked. Cultural shockwave. The morning after, the day after aired, America felt different. Conversations at coffee shops, water coolers, and school bus stops weren't about last night's sports scores or sitcoms. They were about mushroom clouds, fallout shelters, and whether surviving a nuclear war was even worth it. For many viewers, this was the first time the idea of nuclear annihilation had been pulled out of abstract theory and dumped right on their doorstep. TV station switchboards were flooded with calls from viewers who couldn't shake the images. Some parents admitted their children had nightmares for days. Teachers rearranged lesson plans to talk about the movie in class. Even churches wove it into Sunday sermons, framing it as a moral question for the nuclear age. It wasn't just entertainment, it had become a national conversation starter, whether you wanted it to be or not. The media went into overdrive. The New York Times called the broadcast a national trauma. Time magazine said it was the television event that shook the nation. Even newspapers overseas covered the American reaction, noting that a fictional TV movie had managed to do what years of anti-nuclear protests hadn't: make the average American care about the consequences of a nuclear war. And it wasn't just the content that made people talk. The viewing experience itself felt unusual. ABC stripped away commercials during the most intense sequences to keep the tension unbroken. After the credits rolled, they aired a live discussion panel featuring heavy hitters like Henry Kissinger and Robert McNamara debating nuclear policy on national TV. Imagine watching 2 hours of total societal collapse, then immediately hearing some of the world's most powerful former leaders talk about whether it could really happen. It was sobering, to say the least. In an age without streaming or DVRs, there was no catch it later. You either saw it live or you missed it, and that only intensified the feeling that something big had happened. For one night, America wasn't split into 100 entertainment niches. It was united, staring into the same nightmare. Political fallout. When a movie gets under the skin of everyday viewers, that's one thing. When it gets under the skin of the President of the United States, that's another. Ronald Reagan watched the day after before its public broadcast, sitting in the secure setting of Camp David. In his personal diary, he admitted it left him greatly depressed and reinforced his desire to work toward reducing nuclear weapons. For a leader in the middle of the Cold War, that's no small statement, and Reagan wasn't the only one rattled. Members of his national security team noticed his mood shift for days afterward. The film had humanized the stakes of nuclear war in a way that no classified briefing or policy paper ever could. It arrived at a precarious moment in world politics. Just weeks before, the Soviet Union had misinterpreted a NATO military exercise as a possible prelude to a U.S. first strike. Some historians believe that the day after helped cool the temperature, reminding decision-makers on both sides that there would be no winners in a nuclear exchange. Public opinion shifted fast. Membership in anti-nuclear organizations surged. College campuses held packed discussion forums. Local governments passed resolutions urging nuclear arms reduction. For weeks, the topic dominated talk shows, op-eds, and dinner tables. Of course, not everyone embraced the film's message. Some conservative commentators blasted it as fear-mongering or even subtle Soviet propaganda. Defense contractors quietly circulated materials, arguing the movie exaggerated the effects of nuclear weapons. The Reagan administration publicly downplayed the idea that a piece of entertainment could influence policy, but behind the scenes, officials admitted it had left a mark. 4 years later, in 1987, Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the first arms control agreement to actually reduce, rather than just limit, nuclear arsenals. Reagan later pointed to the day after as one of the cultural forces that strengthened his resolve to pursue such a deal. Airing a movie on network TV might seem like a small thing in the grand sweep of Cold War history. But in this case, it became part of the chain of events that nudged two nuclear superpowers towards stepping back from the brink. Media legacy. Before the day after, TV movies were often lightweight, disposable, and quick to fade from memory. But this film changed the rules overnight. It proved that television could handle massive, serious topics with the same impact, or even greater, than the big screen. And it did it without relying on star-studded casts or glossy effects. Its unflinching style became a new benchmark for depicting nuclear war. Gone were the sanitized duck-and-cover films of the 1950s or the abstract strategy debates on Sunday morning news shows. Instead, realism became the standard. You can see its fingerprints on later works like the BBC's Threads, an even bleaker look at nuclear winter, and the American film Testament, which zeroed in on the slow, personal toll of radiation sickness. Schools began showing The Day After in history and social studies classes. Teachers used it to spark discussions about Cold War politics, military strategy, and the moral questions of deterrence. Researchers even studied its effect on viewers' anxiety levels and political opinions, helping launch a new field examining how media influences public policy attitudes. ABC's Gamble also showed other networks the value of creating television events, single broadcasts that everyone feels compelled to watch at the same time. It's a model that would later influence live miniseries, big historical reenactments, and cultural must-watch moments. Of course, part of its impact came from timing. In 1983, there was no internet to distract, no smartphones buzzing with notifications, no streaming library to turn to instead. When something big was on TV, the whole country either tuned in or felt left out of the conversation. The Day After leveraged that moment perfectly, ensuring it would dominate not just the ratings, but the national mood. Even now, in an age of fragmented media, the film stands as a reminder that television can still unite people in a shared emotional experience. It showed that sometimes the most powerful thing a screen can do isn't to entertain, it's to force us to confront the realities we'd rather avoid. The realism factor. Plenty of movies have shown big explosions, but The Day After was different because it made those explosions feel like they could happen in your backyard. That realism didn't happen by accident, it was baked into the production from the start. Nicholas Meyer, the director, was determined to avoid Hollywood cliches. No dramatic slow-motion hero shots, no miraculous last-second rescues. When the bombs dropped, they dropped fast, with a cold, matter-of-fact brutality. The mushroom clouds weren't sleek CGI creations, they were grounded in practical effects, stock footage, and visuals drawn from actual nuclear test films. The filmmakers didn't shy away from showing what came after. Radiation sickness wasn't hinted at, it was shown in detail. Skin burned and blistered, hair fell out, people collapsed from weakness. The makeup team consulted with medical experts to get the symptoms right, creating looks that were disturbingly authentic. Some extras reportedly couldn't look at themselves in the mirror while in costume because it was so unnerving. Even the choice of setting played into the realism. Lawrence, Kansas, wasn't a symbolic city. It was a place that could stand in for thousands of towns across America. It had farms, schools, and small businesses, the kind of backdrop that viewers could easily project themselves into. The idea was simple. If it could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Then, there was the sound design. Meyer and his team avoided over-the-top action movie noise. Explosions sounded blunt and concussive, not theatrical. After the blasts, there were long, uncomfortable silences, filled only by wind or the faint cries of survivors, the kind of quiet that makes you lean in and feel uneasy. The result was a film that didn't feel like science fiction. It felt like the evening news, just projected into the worst-case future. and that was what made people squirm in their living rooms. By presenting nuclear war not as an epic spectacle, but as an everyday tragedy multiplied by millions, The Day After stripped away the safety net of fiction. It wasn't about distant cities or anonymous soldiers, it was about people who looked like you, living in places that looked like yours, facing a nightmare that science said was entirely possible. The people who made it happen. Every powerful movie has a team behind it willing to push past limits, and The Day After was no exception. At the center was Brandon Stoddard, president of ABC Motion Pictures, whose vision for the project went against every safe bet in network television at the time. Stoddard didn't just want ratings, he wanted impact. Finding the right director was a challenge. Many filmmakers turned it down, worried about being branded as political troublemakers. Nicholas Meyer, fresh from Star Trek II, accepted because he saw the script's potential to cut through Cold War rhetoric. He described it not as making entertainment, but as showing the unshowable. The cast was equally committed. Jason Robards brought gravitas to Dr. Russell Oakes, a character who embodied the moral weight of survival. JoBeth Williams, as Nurse Nancy Bauer, conveyed the quiet heroism of medical professionals working with nothing but grit and dwindling supplies. Steve Guttenberg, known at the time for lighter roles, gave a grounded performance as a young man trying to navigate chaos. Behind the camera, the production team worked with military and medical consultants to get details right, from how missile silos operated to the visible progression of radiation sickness. Special effects artists spent hours designing wounds that would pass medical scrutiny. Local volunteers made up the bulk of the extras, many of them spending long days in makeup to become the walking embodiment of nuclear disaster. The logistics were intense. Shooting at real Kansas missile sites required careful coordination, and weather delays sometimes pushed production into grueling schedules. Still, the team pressed on, fueled by the belief that they were making something bigger than just another Sunday night movie. Meyer fought constant battles with network executives over what could and couldn't be shown. His original cut was over 4 hours long and far more graphic, but even in its edited form, it carried the intended punch. He later admitted that only about 40% of what was filmed made it to air, but that 40% was enough to leave a lasting mark on television history. In the end, The Day After was the product of hundreds of people pulling in the same direction, determined to deliver a message they felt the country needed to hear. They didn't just make a movie, they made an event that would echo for decades. The long shadow. Some TV movies fade into the background the moment the credits roll. The Day After didn't just stick around, it became part of the cultural fabric. 4 decades later, it's still studied, discussed, and referenced whenever nuclear tensions flare. Its influence spread far beyond entertainment. In classrooms, it became a teaching tool for history and political science. Teachers would roll in the TV cart, dim the lights, and let the movie speak for itself. Discussions afterward weren't just about the Cold War, but about morality, survival, and the fragility of civilization. In politics, it served as a rare example of a fictional work affecting real-world decisions. While it's impossible to measure exactly how much it swayed policy, Reagan's acknowledgement of its emotional impact remains one of the clearest cases of art influencing a sitting president's thinking. In media, it shifted expectations. Audiences realized that television could handle massive, sobering topics with as much force as theatrical films. Networks realized that taking risks, even terrifying ones, could pay off in ways that went beyond ratings. You can see its DNA in later prestige TV projects, from historical miniseries to socially conscious dramas. Even the film's visual and storytelling style influenced how nuclear war was portrayed afterward. The choice to focus on ordinary people became the gold standard for making catastrophic events feel personal. Movies and shows like Threads, Testament, and later Jericho all owe part of their approach to the groundwork laid in 1983. The Day After's shadow isn't just cultural, it's emotional. For those who watched it live, the memory of that night never fully faded. It wasn't just what they saw on the screen, It was the shared knowledge that millions of others were seeing it too, feeling the same pit in their stomachs. In today's fragmented media landscape, it's hard to imagine a single broadcast pulling that off again. And maybe that's part of its lasting mystique. It captured a unique moment when the world was holding its breath, and a single TV movie dared to show what might happen if we exhaled in the wrong way. That's why, decades later, The Day After still looms large, not just as a film, but as a warning. So there you have it. The night television stopped being harmless background noise and became a collective gut punch. The Day After didn't just scare 100 million Americans, it made them think, argue, and, in some cases, act. Could anything on TV today hit us that hard? Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this with someone who remembers that broadcast, and hit subscribe, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that already could happen.